Hello, welcome to yet another video by TNT. Today we're going to be talking about trauma. What is trauma? That's a word that's thrown around so lightly, and yet we don't really understand the implications of using that term, trauma. With me this morning is Debbie Viper, my very dear friend for a very long time. And I figured she and I could just go back and forth and talk about trauma, and you can listen and learn. So, Debbie, thanks for being here.
Sure.
And tell us a little more about you, Debbie. Why is it that you and I are going to sit here and talk about trauma?
What a great question, because I am not a psychologist. I am not a psychiatrist. And my field of study is biblical studies.
Okay.
And as part of ministry over the years, I've worked with a lot of people who've suffered traumas of various sorts. But along with that, I'm also a survivor of trauma. I grew up in a home that at the time I didn't label as abusive, just simply violent, but came to understand over the years that I really had carried with me a lot of wounding from that time in my life. And then I've had the opportunity recently to walk various people through traumas of various types, as well as finding myself, even as an adult, the victim of abuse again, not in my own home, but within my larger circle. So I have some experience.
Right, and experience is a great teacher.
Is.
A lot of what we become and how we perceive ourselves post-trauma is very dependent on how much we educate ourselves on the subject, how well we understand it.
Yes.
And that enables us to not just understand our circumstances, but also allows us the opportunity and the privilege of walking others through their trauma. So that's really the crux behind why we do what we do. These videos are not because we're experts on the subject at all. It's our experience has taught us something. Our reading, our research has taught us a lot.
Yes.
And I know you're a reader and I am a researcher, so that's what we do.
Yeah.
So here we are just sharing with you from our experience and from what we have gleaned from our time of reading and researching. I hope you learn with us. And I hope you can apply what you learned today to help you as you move past the trauma in your life and in the lives of those whom you love. So let's start with the very basic question, Debbie. What is trauma?
What is trauma? You know, I remember as that question first came to me, I was reading so many different books, and each author spoke about trauma in slightly different ways. I had some really high level, very informed, doctoral level, professional level definitions, and then I had some really basic ones. And as I was thinking through that, I began wondering about the relationship between trauma as it's used in the medical field and trauma as it's used in the mental health field, and then trauma as it's popularly used, because that's become kind of a buzzword in our society lately. And maybe it's about time, but I think we also need to understand it. So talk to me, Cynthia, since you come from a medical background, what would be a medical understanding of the term trauma? How is it used?
Trauma is synonymous with injury. So any injury really is a source of trauma. Now, medically speaking, you can look at the physical and you can look at the psychological.
Right.
Okay, so physical trauma would be caused by a physical injury, a physical impact, a blunt force trauma. You know, those are the terms that are used. And oftentimes the word injury is used, or sometimes the word trauma is used. And although they're synonymous, the word injury does not set off this alarm of something of greater magnitude.
Okay.
Whereas the word trauma tends to be more associated with something of a larger magnitude. So if you stub your toe, you just injured your toe.
Okay. Okay.
But if you got your toe caught, your foot caught in the lawnmower,
Oh,
that's,
yeah.
trauma to your
Yes.
foot. So really, the
Okay.
word trauma is more significant in terms of the magnitude of the injury.
Okay.
Psychologically speaking, trauma is any event or series of events that have injured your state of mind, your psyche, your ability to process thoughts, your ability to um, respond to similar situations. You talk of PTSD, you talk of triggers, those are all things we will be talking about. And those are only found in situations of trauma when something or a series of events trigger a certain response in your mind, in your psyche. Those are traumatic events.
And so I think it's interesting how you were describing that just now, because sometimes people will talk about the event itself as the trauma. And yet I heard you say a traumatic event. And so the cause of the wound or trauma is the trigger perhaps, or the event.
The event.
Like you talked about stubbing your toe, that would be the precipitating event.
Yes.
That would then cause an injury, but oh my goodness, that picture of a lawnmower, obviously a bigger thing.
Yes.
Although, let's suppose that the person who stubbed their toe is a ballet dancer.
Right.
So for them, even though it would still be a minor event that caused the injury,
Right.
it would be much more significant for that person.
Yes, because it has debilitated them from doing something that is a very big major part of their lives.
Right. And unfortunately, so much of the time I find that people want to compare. Well, I really shouldn't be experiencing this to this degree because that person went through.
Right.
And yet we don't know the circumstances in that person's life, how God created them, what their personality is, what their life circumstances are, and how that might actually make it a bigger.
Yes, because we don't know the significance
right.
of the event, the significance of the relationship with a perpetrator, if it's,
right,
as a result of abuse, or if it is if you're talking about death, for example, are you talking about what is the relationship between you and the person that passed away?
Exactly.
All of those are determinants, for the degree of trauma or how long it takes you to recover from it, or triggers.
Right.
Is a ballet dancer going to get, really phobic about stepping on her toes again? Well, she may be a little concerned about breaking it again, and she's going to have to move past that fear. But when you talk about someone who's suffered a gunshot wound, the sound of a gun can just immediately take them back to that moment.
Right, and it's not a conscious thing that they don't think, oh, that reminds me of.
No.
Our brains just immediately hear the sound and react.
What your brain does is it makes you relive the sights, the sounds, and the smells associated with that event. And so if you have a gunshot wound and you hear a firecracker or a gun being, something that sounds like a gun, logically you may know it's not a gun. But what it has done is it's taken your mind, psychological trauma as resulted from it, it takes your mind straight to that moment, and you start reliving the moment of trauma, totally unrelated to what triggered it.
Right. Right.
And that's what triggers are. They're not things you can control. Oftentimes they're not predictable. Once you know they happen, then they become predictable. You know this is how you're probably going to respond to such and such.
I discovered just recently that there was someone with whom I had a very difficult time. I just couldn't relate to them well. I was suspicious of them and their motives all the time. And what occurred to me was that they had the same role as a person who abused me when I was a child. So even meeting them and knowing that they had the same role
was a trigger of sorts.
It was a trigger, yeah.
Yeah.
And I really had to work through that. So it's trauma is a really complex subject.
It really is. It really is. And so, we've kind of just touched on the subject and given you a brief overview. We're going to dive a little deeper into some aspects of trauma in a moment.